I'm back. Mr. Clark's back. Time to take a look at topic 12.1 and the emergence of absolute monarchies throughout Europe. We're going to take a look at some of the characteristics of an absolute monarchy, including the concept of divine right to rule. We'll see how the Spanish power grew under Charles V and Philip II. We'll take a look at France and see how France built a centralized monarchy after the wars of religion. We'll look at Louis XIV and his absolute monarchy. We'll take a look at how art flourished in Spain and in France. So as we go through this, feel free to pause wherever you need to. Your best course of action might be able to watch the recorded lesson on one device and have your Chromebook open so you can respond to the questions as you watch the recorded lesson along the way. So we look at question number one: how did governments change throughout Europe as the old feudal system came to an end? During the 1500s, nation-states with strong central governments began to replace the chaotic period of time in the Middle Ages. If you remember, during the Middle Ages, you had a lot of pillaging and a lot of people coming along coastal areas and coming in and stealing and basically burning down villages and killing people. So monarchies now ruled large areas, began to levy taxes. Taxes provide revenue, and that will allow for them then to provide services or even protection with the militaries, which can then extend their power in that particular region. With Louis XIV, well, any monarchy truly ruled by divine right. What were some of the risks did his subjects run if they questioned his authority? So anytime a leader proclaimed their right to rule came directly from God, leaders created fear amongst their subjects. If people thought to challenge the monarchy, they can ultimately be punished not necessarily on earth, but according to their belief system, by God himself. When we look at the characteristics of an absolute monarchy, they always start out with a single powerful ruler, little to no input from the people. If there's a legislature, it's usually for the purpose of pretending to give people input. They could pass laws, but ultimately the monarchy had the final authority. So maybe the legislature is more for show purposes. Hey, look, we have a whole bunch of people we let go into the legislature. They can vote and discuss issues, but then ultimately, the king decides exactly what's going to occur in the country. By the 1500s, Spain was a pretty powerful country. Columbus had sailed for Spain, opened up the New World to Spanish colonization. When you reflect back in history and kind of look at the way the Americas are structured or set up today, even though the United States is a dominant country in the Americas, you still have Spanish-speaking areas throughout all of the Americas. And as a result, the long legacy of Spain is still being felt today throughout the Americas. Wealth from the colonies made Spain the most powerful nation for a period of time throughout all of Europe. They had a very powerful navy as well, the Spanish Armada. How did Charles I begin to expand his power? In 1519, he became the heir to the Habsburg Empire. This included German states as well as the Netherlands or the Dutch. As the ruler of the Habsburg Empire, he took on the title of Charles V. What role did religion play in the policies of Charles V? Charles was a devout Catholic. Initially, he pushed for Catholicism throughout the empire. After meeting some resistance from German Protestants, he granted the German states religious freedom, or the ability to choose their own religion. Here you see Charles V pictured in the early 1500s, more of a drawing. He became a ruler over both the Spanish and the Habsburg empires. He did face constant attacks and warfare, in particular with the Ottoman Empire, which is based out of Turkey, and the Ottomans controlled parts of North Africa and what to say in the modern-day Middle East. 7, how did foreign conflict play a role in Charles V's abdication of the throne? Charles met a lot of resistance in the east from the Ottoman Empire, as you mentioned earlier. He held them off from taking Austria, but eventually they took over Hungary in 1556, and exhausted Charles, as you see in the painting below, abdicated his throne. And if you don't know what the word abdicate means, it means to give up power. So usually if a monarchy steps down, it's called abdicating the throne. We'll see this later on in history in other countries, including perhaps most famously, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne during the Russian Revolution. They gave up the dynasty that had dominated Russia for over 300 years, the Romanov dynasty. And we'll be discussing the Romanovs as we move forward in this chapter. Eight, how is the Habsburg Empire divided? Well, lands in Central Europe went to his brother Ferdinand to rule the Holy Roman Empire. His son Philip II was given Spain, the Netherlands, and some of Spain's overseas empire to rule. When you look at Philip II, he ruled for 42 years. The portrait shows Philip II, the King of Spain, dressed very simply. He was a devout Catholic. He expanded Spanish influence, and he too reigned as an absolute monarch. Some more information about Philip. What impact did Philip II have on the Spanish Empire? He strengthened the Catholic Church, and that's another thing we still see the traces of here in the Americas. Catholicism is still a major religion, especially in the Spanish-speaking areas of Latin America. He made his power even stronger and more absolute. He increased the wealth and power of Spain. If we look at number 11, Philip was different from some monarchs. He did not abuse the powers of privilege. He very rarely engaged in some of the activities that was very common for royalty during this period of time. He didn't hunt or joust. He studied government policies and military strategies. He lived as a monk, often in isolation and away from his servants. Why did Philip try to invade England? What was the result? Well, because he was a strong advocate of Catholicism and viewed the Protestant English Queen Elizabeth as the enemy, he made England a natural target. Queen Elizabeth had ordered her ships to raid Spanish treasure ships in colonial cities. He sent a large Spanish armada, or the Spanish Navy, to invade England. And England defeated the Spanish armada, and they were forced to retreat, ultimately in defeat. And King Philip II was beat. He didn't really think that was a treat. And back at home in Spain, he took a lot of heat. Here's a little map of some of the wars of Philip II. Which battles shown took place in territory ruled directly by Spain. None of the battles took place in Spanish-controlled territory. This illustrates that the battles were a result of Spanish aggression, meaning they were very aggressive in trying to conquer other territories. That's the key message here of this particular map. What decision did Spanish rulers make that weakened the Spanish economy? A lot of people point to the military loss versus England as a turning point in domination and the loss of Spanish power. After the victory by the English, they now become the most powerful country in the world and became more dominant in colonial areas as well. Philip's successors were weaker rulers who allowed costly overseas empires to begin to drain the Spanish treasury. The high taxes drained the wealth of the middle class. And then the expulsion of other religious groups like Muslims and Jews from the empire removed a lot of skilled artisans and merchants from the empire, thus weakening it further. Arts and literature, Spain's golden century. Explain one reason the arts might have flourished during this period of Spanish history. Well, this was Spain's golden century with its empire at its height in power and wealth. Therefore, there was more money to support the arts, more patrons, just like we had looked at during the Renaissance. What dynasty rose to power in France after religious wars? The Bourbon dynasty. A sad event in history, in particular in French history, but in all of history as well, was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Once again, there's ongoing tension in France and all around the world between Protestants and Catholics, in this case here, French Protestants or Huguenots and French Catholics. Violence broke out on St. Bartholomew's Day on August 24th, 1572. It was at a royal wedding. It was a Catholic plot to kill off some of the French Protestants, or Huguenots. Thousands died both during the massacre and in the days afterwards. You could see in the painting there. People basically being dragged through the streets, killed, pushed out windows. Very sad and devastating event in history. You can see here painting a St. Bartholomew Day massacre. And thousands of French Huguenots were killed. 18. What do you think Henry IV meant when he said Paris is well worth a mass? So Henry IV was a Protestant, the first king in the Bourbon line. He converted to Catholicism to appease the majority of the French citizens, which were Catholics. Pretty much his quote meant that he was willing to convert his religion, because he wasn't really that passionate about one or the other, to be able to control Paris in a more peaceful fashion. Cardinal Richelieu's treatment of the nobles and the Huguenots strengthened the monarchy. He was basically the right-hand enforcer for the king. He helped to defeat private armies and fortified castles. He worked to eliminate any of the threats from the Huguenots. In 1643, King Louis XIV, or Louis XIV at the time, became king. At the ripe old age, the experienced age of 5 years old. It was Cardinal Mazarin who helped run the government until Louis was old enough to do so he had a lot of support. What was the Fronde? This was an attempt at rebellion or civil war of nobility, merchants and urban poor, and peasants against royal authority. After the death of Mazarin in 1661, the 23-year-old Louis vowed to take full control of the government. He wasn't going to take it anymore. This is a little picture from the Fronde. Louis XIV called himself, he was a self-proclaimed Sun King. He said, "I am the state." Describe how each statement reflects absolutism, and explain what you find to be the best slogan for Louis. Explain what you find to be the best slogan for Louis XIV. Well, the opinion aspect, that'll be your own conclusion to make. Well, the sun was the center of the universe, and as a Sun King, he was the center of France. With the quote, "I am the state," he was reaffirming his absolute monarchy and his position within it. Either one is a good choice. So I left the answer to 21 at the very top there. So if you look here, this is what is called an infograph of Louis XIV and absolutism. So this kind of gives you a look at some of the different policies here. He followed the proven policies of Cardinal Richelieu. He spent many hours on a daily basis attending to government affairs. He expanded the bureaucracy, which means the expansion of the government. He appointed intendants whose job was to collect taxes. He recruited soldiers and help carry out his policies. He gave many jobs to middle-class, wealthy men. This would give him additional support amongst the middle class. And he built up the French army into the strongest and biggest army throughout all of Europe. So you look at some of the things you can kind of list out for 23 that I mentioned a moment ago. Strong army, strong team of advisors, strengthen the economy, expanded and reorganized the government. Next, we're going to look at Versailles. And just be careful at any time you mention Versailles. I've often heard students call Versailles Versailles. Don't pronounce it the way it looks, pronounce it the way it's supposed to be pronounced, which is Versailles. Alsace, if I hear you call it Versailles. So Versailles Palace, you can see a couple different photographs there. One is the exterior, one's the interior. One of the most lavish palaces ever built in the history of the world, not just in Europe. Beautiful architecture, mirrors, artwork, statues, lavish gardens. He believed this to be the great representation for the Sun King. King Louis XIV is going to be remembered as somebody who wasted a lot of French tax dollars on things that were unnecessary. Described the levee. It was the daily ceremony in which the nobility gathered to help the king get out of bed. So he basically had a whole entourage in there, help him lift them up, put his robe on, powder his face a little bit, get him ready for the day. How did Louis XIV control the nobility? Well, he created competition amongst the nobility. Who could treat him better, who would do better things for him would gain his favor. And in return, he did not tax the nobility out of respect for their loyalty. There's Louis XIV there, quite a head of hair. How long did Louis XIV reign in power, stay in power? Well, this is kind of like a cheat code here. If you take over when you're like 5 years of age, you have a little bit better opportunity to serve such a long period of time. Most people don't lead a country or rule a nation or become an emperor or king until they're much older. What are some of the possible effects, both foreign and domestic, from Louis XIV's costly wars? The French treasury was drained of much of its wealth because of foreign wars. In fact, it was Louis XIV who helped provide support for the United States during the Revolutionary War. Other European powers were weary of France because of their aggressive actions. On the home front, struggling citizens questioned the cost of foreign adventures when they're having so much trouble on the home front. 29, why did Louis XIV expel the Huguenots? Was this a good or bad decision? A very strong Catholic was Louis XIV, so he saw the Protestant minority as a threat to his power. Ultimately, a bad decision, as over 100,000 Protestants fled the country. They're amongst the hardest working, most prosperous, and loyal citizens in the country. It's kind of unfortunate that there's always religious prejudice within society, whether it's back during this period of time or even still today in a modern day society. So we look at the pros and cons of having an absolute ruler. Well, there's absolutely some pros and there's absolutely some cons. The pros, strong leadership, strong military, desire to expand the empire. Cons, individual rights are infringed upon, uneven distribution of wealth, and often there's an unfair class system. Well, I hope you enjoyed our first look at absolutism and the expansion of the power of different monarchies throughout Europe. We'll continue looking more at some of these monarchies as we move forward into further into the chapter. Until next time, Mr. Clark is